Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Professor Carla Simonini from Loyola University, Chicago, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Italian history back to when unification began and finished, and also why so many people from Southern Italy came to America. So welcome, Carla. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And this should be fun. A lot of people ask me all the time about what I know about Italian history, which isn't much. So hopefully we'll get some great insight from you.
Well, I should talk a little bit maybe about my specific background. I got my PhD in Italian studies, which was concentrated mostly on Italian literature. And then I ended up doing a dissertation that was very interdisciplinary, and I started looking at the Italian American experience, especially through literature. So I'm not a historian in particular, but I actually we have to start from Italian history in order to understand the Italian immigrant experience in the United States. So that's been my approach in my courses and in my research, looking at that periods in Italy that produced mass waves of immigration, what was going on there, and then what happened to those immigrants once they landed on American shores. So,
and we all know kind of our family, what their experience was, but there were a lot of similarities and also a lot of differences between, why people came and why they settled in certain places and things like that. Mm-hmm. So my first question is, what were the events that led up to the unification of Italy? We know that there were, all of these regions, all these cities, and all of these various areas. What brought that all together?
Well, Italian Risorgimento, which is the unification movement, is extremely complicated, and as I tell my students, very Italian. And here we have, the revolution of in 1776 in the United States, blah blah blah. Italy, actually, they talk about having three different wars of revolution that happened in different stages, and depending on who you talk to, the actual Risorgimento movement, some date it from 1815 all the way up until after World War I. So there's different periods in which Italy speaks about going into its becoming unified. But generally speaking, the official date that Italy recognizes and celebrates as unification is 1861. So if you think 1861, that's about the time that the United States was heading into the Civil War. So Italy, as a united nation, in a modern sense, has a very short history, shorter than the United States. Generally speaking, they talk about 1815 as being a seminal year that set off the unification impetus. So in 1815, that was after Napoleon was kind of, his kicked out, and they had this thing called the Congress of Vienna, and more or less all the nations of Europe went back to the state they were in before the Napoleonic invasion. So you had the former monarchs taking back over, and basically it was a restoration to pre-Napoleonic times. But there had been some things that I guess we could say were good that came out of the Napoleonic reign. One of them was that there were some constitutional rights that were guaranteed. And when the old monarchs came in, they were going back to more of a authoritative position, whereas all over Italy, there had been a taste of this sense of, well, we as people should have more rights. So there started to be movements for greater independence, and also the idea that Italy at the time, they called them staterelli. They were divided up into small states, but there were really 8 major ones. One of them was the Kingdom of Sardinia under the House of Savoy. There was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south that was under the Bourbon rule. Those were the 2 biggest ones. There were the Papal States under the Pope in the center. And then there were a series of small, they called them duchies. There was one in Lombardy and Venezia. There was the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And then there were duchies of Parma and Modena. So those were the major blocks there. And out of all of those, the only one that was under a monarch who was from the same territory, from the Italian territories, was the Kingdom of Sardinia under the House of Savoy. So that ended up becoming sort of the hegemony for the Risorgimento movement. That was, Italy coming under Piedmont really was sort of became the central focus for the Risorgimento. But within that, there were a lot of different figures and different trends. I think many people have heard of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was the great war hero. There was Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a great thinker. He was the one who thought very intellectually about the need for Italian independence. And there was also a great statesman, Camillo Benso Conte di Cavour, who was basically the Secretary of State in the Kingdom of Sardinia under the House of Savoy. So these three men, who didn't necessarily even like each other and had conflicts over time, somehow managed to put together a system which led to the 1861 unification of Italy. So Giuseppe Garibaldi was very impressed with Mazzini's thinking. Mazzini was a great thinker. He always had these grandiose plans, and he set up these societies, one society in particular called the Giovane Italia, where people would get together and discuss, men would get together and discuss ideas of liberty and self-rule and things like that. And it set off certainly the spark of wanting to be under self-rule. And although he had grandiose ideas, he wasn't a very good tactician. And every single time he started to set off a movement, they failed. So these movements were called moti. Garibaldi, on the other hand, was a great, everyone seems to concur, was a great general. He knew how to fight war, and he had the greatest success. And Cavour was a diplomat, so he was aware of the realities of a new state needing to make alliances, and he would sometimes make alliances that would go against what Garibaldi wanted or what Mazzini wanted. But again, somehow the three of them came together, and in 1861 you had Garibaldi's famous moment where he had conquered all of southern Italy and advanced up to Naples, and he really wanted a true republic, not a monarchy. But he, I think at that point, understood what Cavour was looking for and handed over all the conquered territories to King Victor Emmanuel II, and that is the moment we consider Italian unity in 1861. Still, it wasn't complete. Rome was still under the control of the Pope, and Venice was still under Austria. So there was still more work to be done, and that didn't happen until later in the decades in the 1870s when Rome and Venice, and there was a whole bunch of complicated things that happened during that period. So that's kind of a quick and dirty overview of a very complicated and messy history that took place in phases over a long period of time. It saw Giuseppe Garibaldi and Mazzini at times had bounties on their heads and had to flee the countries, had to flee the Italian territories because they were wanted. And the great enemy during this whole period, even though there were different alliances, it was this sense of Austria. So when you talk about Lombardy, Venezia, they were under Austrian rule, and all those duchies were not directly under Austrian rule, but they were allied with it. So the big enemy was Austria. So it was Italy, this nascent sense of Italianness, trying to push out the foreign rule that was Austria, either directly or indirectly. And in the south, the Bourbon states, which were Spanish rule, was the House of Bourbon from Spain.